My name is Emily Jackson. I'm the SVP of Sustainability at The Economist Group, and I'm going to welcome my speakers to the stage. And as I'm talking, this session is going to be on Scope 3 emissions and how to generate accurate emissions. This is a topic that it does keep me up at night, and as I can see from the number of people in the room, you are equally affected by it. And so we're hoping from the speakers today that we will find some answers to how we can measure accurately. So joining me today are Alexandra Hammond, the Head of Sustainable Procurement and Supply Chain at the NHS, Tom DeLay, Chief Executive at Carbon Trust, Johan Demler, SAP, and Elsa Lagerlbauer, Solutions Advisor at EcoVadis. So we know that global supply chains in only 8 industries account for 50% of the world's emissions. And we know that most of those emissions, or a large proportion of those emissions, actually come from the operations of the organization. So measuring Scope 3 emissions accurately is the only way that we can get to net zero. We have to measure these emissions to set the targets. I'm going to be taking questions throughout, so please use the Slido and we'll ask questions as we go. But maybe just quickly, a quick show of hands, how many of you are measuring Scope 3 emissions? Right, great. So I think that kind of shows the BCG report that we looked at, that a third of companies are measuring their Scope 3 emissions and 70% are not yet looking at Scope 3 emissions. And 30 to 40%, so the ones that have got their hands up, are likely to be somehow getting it wrong. I'm going to start with you, Alexandra. So the NHS is setting out to be the first net zero National Health Service. How do you look at Scope 3 emissions?
Thanks so much, Emily, and lovely to see you all here. The NHS has a very clear net zero emissions target. We were the first health system to declare a net zero target, and so we intend to be net zero by 2040 for our emissions and 2045 for our Scope 3 emissions. And that's a big ask. I can imagine the NHS is a big and disparate organization. So what we've done is really try to set out a really clear roadmap for our suppliers to understand what is expected of them and when. So we have something called the Net Zero Supplier Roadmap for the NHS, which sets out a kind of staggered approach to getting on the road to net zero. We will not be net zero without our supply chain getting there too. So we've got a Scope 1 and 2 emissions sooner in 23 and 24, and then from 2027 we're asking our suppliers to tell us their Scope 3 emissions targets and make them in line with our goals of being net zero by 2045. And then we also want their product carbon impacts, and this is another thing. This is going to be a real challenge going forward from 2028. So we are measuring our own suppliers' impacts, but also engaging with our suppliers to make sure that they're on the right track and prepared.
And Tom, why does accuracy in measuring the Scope 3 emissions, why does it matter?
Scope 3 emissions increasingly is the foundation against which every net zero claim is going to be assessed. Scope 1 and 2 simply doesn't do it for all the reasons we've discussed. So Scope 3 really matters, and the accuracy really matters. It matters for a number of reasons. Firstly, most net zero claims, well over half, fail the simplest of sincerity and credibility tests, and I'm happy to come back on what we mean by sincerity. But just as it's also a more difficult challenge to actually measure your Scope 3, it's also becoming more important because an increasing number of organisations are disclosing Scope 3 footprints as part of their financial reporting process, whether that's part of the annual accounts, whether it's something that's TCFD. Depending on the jurisdiction, it'll be something different. But the minute you have reporting to the level of financial control required for disclosed accounts, accuracy matters. So nobody gets Scope 3 right. There's no such thing as right. But you've got to be right within a reasonable tolerance for the claim that you're going to make based on that measurement. So that's why accuracy matters. It's because it underpins net zero claims, Greenwash we're in the era of greenwash. Greenwash is the enemy for most organizations, and this is the best way of addressing that problem.
Great. And Elsa, when you're working with companies at EcoVadis, what kind of challenges are you coming across in collecting that data from suppliers?
Yeah, so what we're actually seeing, we rate companies, right, on their sustainability practices. And what we're seeing is that getting visibility into your suppliers' emissions is very, challenging because the data isn't really there, right? We were talking about it. There's obviously some errors. Also, if we look at a typical company's supply chain, there's a lot of small and medium enterprises that are only at the beginning of their journey and understanding how they can measure. And obviously, that's the first step in reducing, right? You can't really reduce what you can't measure. However, there is a tendency to focus just on, getting perfect data, and that's not really what's going to, drive decarbonization across the supply chain. We need to be engaging, and companies need to be engaging their suppliers beyond the data. Yes, on measurements, but also on commitments that they're making, right? Science-based targets has kind of set a little bit of the gold standard in setting decarbonization targets, but also the actions that they're making. And when you think of it, even if we had perfect data, the journey wouldn't stop there, right? There's improvements to make, there's targets to set, there's progress to track against those targets, and that's how we're going to, get to decarbonization, really.
And Johan, we've talked a lot about data, and you'd think that technology might be able to plug the gap and collecting that accurately. But the tools have been on the market for maybe a couple of years, and I don't think there's yet a silver bullet. I mean, what's your view on the role that technology can play?
So technology definitely acts as an enabler for sustainability. So they basically support these processes, but also depend on kind of the standards that are out there or on the primary data that is available out there. So we basically collaborate and support that process, but we cannot lead that by ourselves. It definitely needs not only technology to that, it needs standards to that, but it also needs the collaboration of industries and companies that they really work along their value chain together to drive, basically come to better data quality in order then to drive action.
So we're back to you, Alexandra. If we're talking about primary data and the role that companies can play, can you explain a little bit about how you're actually collecting the data? Is it a bottom-up approach or using spend?
Yeah, so we have a carbon footprint for the NHS, and it's pretty big. And a lot of that is based on spend for the, originally, when we put that together. And traditionally, that's been the way that we've used that spend proxy as a way of measuring data. Now, there's all sorts of problems with that I'm sure the people in this room are familiar with. Certainly price volatility, and really getting into any kind of, how do you actually improve or get yourself to net zero without spending any money. So we've introduced a hybrid model now where we are taking the significant high volume and high carbon elements of our supply chain, identifying them and understanding better what they comprise. And so we can have a sort of modular approach to our supply chain where we are still using spend because we need it to fill the gaps, but where we possibly can fill the gaps with activity-based data and specific information about those products and services, we add that into the model. So it's really a work in progress, and sometimes it's not perfect. It's not where I don't think anyone should have the ambition of getting it 100% right. But what we are trying to do is at pace improve the data so that it becomes less dependent on just spend categories as a proxy and more dependent on activity.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. So you should be looking at your largest suppliers, and then you're still using industry averages on a spend basis. So is there anything being done to improve industry averages? And I'll kind of throw that out there to answer? Are there any initiatives out there that are making that more accurate? Because that would obviously help the other chunk of emissions you're collecting.
A simple answer is industry averages aren't bad for many things. Because something's a big item in the supply chain doesn't necessarily mean it's the highest impact. So actually identifying the areas which really have a very significant impact and focusing on those, trying to get away from averages on those and move on to primary data. The more primary data you can put in, the more accurate you will get as a result. But even that isn't perfect. The reality is that if you look at net zero, it's a pathway. And the guidance around the first, second, and third stages is pretty much established. You can debate whether it's always right, because it isn't. But by the time you get towards the back end of a net zero pathway, you're in the Wild West. The guidance is all over the place. Carbon accounting doesn't really exist at that point. So the best you can do actually is to disclose your best assumptions, your approach. At that point, you're going to be using primarily secondary data because your suppliers won't be there at all.
Yeah.
So by all means, move from primary towards primary data by engaging with your supply chain. That's got to be the right first point. But if you really want to talk about net zero and get to the end point, you're going to have to be very clear about the assumptions that you're making and why you're making them.
Right.
Can I add to that? Because I really like the way collaborating with your supply chain also means that you probably need to break down the perspective on a product level. So it's much easier then to collaborate with your suppliers based on the product, basically the different materials that come together. And that definitely then also helps to have primary data based on that product. So we will not have the full scope of all your suppliers, but based on that product, you really can trace it back and make sure that you have accurate data, primary data, that you can aggregate to the point when it leaves your gate, so that you have the product carbon footprint of your material, of your product.
And that's the ambition, right, Elsa? So when when we're collecting this data, of course it's got to be accurate, but the point of collecting it is to be able to set accurate targets.
Yeah, and I think also in talking about industry averages, there's a lot of it's a good start, but there's a lot of limitations there where we talked, you were talking about supplier engagement, driving improvements. It doesn't allow you to compare, right? It doesn't allow you to benchmark. It doesn't allow you to know, which of your suppliers are doing better or worse. And obviously, it's not like there's perfect benchmarking out there because the data isn't there yet, but we won't get to that with industry averages. And what we've seen, at least at EcoVadis, is that you need to kind of segment and understand, get a baseline of your suppliers and where they are in the journey and help them with tools, drive improvement based on where they are, right? So if we have the majority, we've seen, I think, just under 50% of companies of the 15,000 we've assessed on carbon that are very low maturity, beginner level, where they need a calculator to start calculating their emissions. There's about 3%, companies that are advanced, meaning they have a science-based target. Their data is independently verified, and then the next step is actually delivering on those commitments, right, and tracking their emissions every year and reducing that and taking action. So it doesn't allow you to assess that maturity and to adapt to that and to adapt your decarbonization strategy with industry averages.
So 100% perfect Scope 3 emissions data, we're not there yet. It's not going to, is it going to happen? But more and more we're reporting our targets or emissions with financial KPIs. So we go every quarter or every year, and this information is reporting. How nervous do we need to be about doing this? Or is there a certain error margin? How credible is this data that we're reporting, Tom?
I think we should be very nervous. And the bigger the organization, the more vulnerable it is to challenge, the more nervous it should be. The simple problem is sincerity. It's a strange word. It's not management speak, but we all understand what we mean by it. The reality is that most net zero pathways fail the sincerity test because either the assumptions that have been put in at some point on time are simply not credible. And that's the biggest single cause. The second is that if you take that net zero pathway and aggregate it with others, maybe within a sector, maybe across sectors, the end result isn't net zero for us all. If you look at some of the net zero pathways that depend on an enormous nature-based contribution at the back end, enormous land use, there isn't enough land to meet all the net zero pathways that are laying claim to that. So that's the second challenge. And the third are people who sadly are out there and for whom status quo is better than transformation. Right. And they will simply go along with the story of I've got scope 3, I've got net zero, and with no real intent of carrying it through to the end, because they know that the end game for them is, as they see it, impossible. The transformation is too fundamental. So add together those three, and it's pretty easy to pick off almost any net zero pathway. The response, quite simply, is to be as humble and honest as you can be about the approach that you've used, the data accuracy that you've relied on, the fact that you have been able to identify the most important parts of your value chain and focus on them to get primary data where you possibly can, and describe the whole thing as work in progress. Yeah. Anybody who says that's the number without saying, and it's work in progress, is kidding themselves.
So would you say the NHS is humble and honest?
I mean, if I can speak on behalf of them, yes, I think we are. I think we're really quite clear that we're not getting 100% of the accurate data. But I think what's really important when we talk about things like Scope 3, it seems so big, it seems so insurmountable, and it can sometimes be, and that sort of third group of people you talked about, Tom, who are kind of just, they can't even begin to fathom the transformation that's required. I think we need to start smaller. When I talked about earlier about how we work with activity-based data, we're talking about products, like Jonas said. We're saying, we're saying, okay, we want to look at hips for hip replacements. We want to look and understand what are the materials that are in those devices. What is the weight of those devices? How much metal is in there? How much? How many? Where, as best we can find out, do these materials come from? And by asking our suppliers these simple questions when we're buying those products, it helps them begin to ask the questions of their supply chains. And so having net zero targets for Scope 3, super important, but actually understanding what it means to get there is I think really, really critical. And so for big organizations like the NHS that buy enormous amounts of things and services, we have a responsibility to not just tell our suppliers they need to be net zero by a certain date, but also work with them, help them understand what it's going to take to get there, and have a sort of mutually reinforcing program of working together. And I think we also need to listen to what our suppliers are doing. A lot of our suppliers are already, there's a lot of leaders, there are a lot of laggards, but where there's good stuff happening, we need to collaborate. I know that word is too often used, but we do. We need to be transparent and open and find out what they're doing so that we can learn and make sure that we're coming up with common methodologies.
And then coming back to technology, because this is a question that I've thought about a number of times, is you've got your procurement department, they've got the ESG data about the suppliers, they know how much everything costs, and then you've got the sustainability department, it's collecting the emissions, no one's, the data's not being shared in the systems. Is that something that's coming, where that kind of collective data, where you're, yes, that's to you, SAP.
Maybe let me give a bit a different take on that. So I think also on Scope 3 emissions, you can actually do a lot if you're capable to measure very accurately your Scope 1 and 2 emission, and then also make sure that you can share it with your value chain. Because we often talk about the supply chain, only kind of upstream emission, but you're actually also part of that whole value chain. So what are you doing as a company to actually also make sure that you can share this data across the value chain? And there I think technology will help a lot, also sharing that data or making it possible that you're able to share that data from one company to another. And then it's actually a lot of pressure for all these individual contributors to that value chain to make sure that they have accurate and validated Scope 1 and 2 emissions that they simply hand over from one company to another. I think that is also a key where technology could help and would also require that we think more in networks and collaborate more instead of that every company is measuring their own emissions from their own perspective. But that will remain also a challenge, not only from technology, also again from the standards and from the whole industries that need to collaborate on that journey.
Are there questions coming through? I'm going to ask questions in a minute, coming on a Slido, please. But there's another point, and it's about emissions measurement and driving business value. Because you go through the hotspotting exercise, you look at your emissions, your hotspots, but how does that actually drive value for the business?
I mean, the first thing is that Scope 3 allows you to have a different relationship with your supply chain up and downstream. And there's almost always a business benefit in there. Again, the first stage of a net zero pathway is almost always to optimize what you currently do, changing some of the parameters against which you optimize. Years ago, we worked with Dyson on the design of all their white goods, and they had a parametric model that simply put energy, materials, water was a sensitivity, onto a common platform. And as the engineers were working on the next generation, they were factoring in energy use and carbon emissions as part of the calculation. So optimizing is an enormous benefit. There's almost never a net cost. The next bit is probably getting more expensive. It's where you have to actually start making investments, and that's where the standards, unfortunately, the guidance don't help. You build a new factory to make something better. The embedded carbon emissions from that new factory can't be amortized as you would in financial accounting. It has to be taken in year one. It's crazy. Doesn't make sense. And then you finally get to the point where the uncertainty becomes a real problem. But if you don't prepare for the uncertainty by preparing options that would allow you to make that transition, it will hit you sooner or later. And the longer term your investor's perspective, the more important that is to business value in the short term. So if you're in a sector where it's obvious that the end game is going to be a problem, you better have some options to maintain business value. But in the early stages, optimization is almost always a win.
Are you seeing something similar as well, Asa?
Yeah, definitely. I think, for example, from a risk perspective, right? There's with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of companies, having kind of supply chains disrupted, really, and it's becoming really important to reduce risk and emissions and sustainability altogether in a way is a way of knowing that you're partnering with the right suppliers, really. So I'm looking at it kind of more from a corporate perspective than a product level. So it's interesting to have kind of both sides here. But I think that's one of the kind of biggest really benefit, and then there's also engaging your suppliers on a continuous basis on that topic, creates discussions around innovation, and a closer relationship with those suppliers, that you're partnering with the right companies that represent your own goals. So there's cost reduction also that you talked about, but I think those are kind of the main areas where it adds a lot of value to a company and a business, really.
Great. Questions?
I can go the traditional way of asking questions.
Hello, thank you for talking about this important subject. I'm Ashley Bateson, a sustainability consultant at Hawley. I've got a question about cultural changes arising from carbon reduction pathways. So I'm looking at our Scope 3 emissions, realising that where we locate our offices has an impact. So how people commute, do business travel. We might have to change suppliers and products we use. And there are various behavioural and cultural impacts. I just wondered if you've started to deal with those things in the areas you work in.
Okay, great. And if there are any other questions, we'll take them now as well. Please, there's a question here.
Hello, Catherine Smith from Lumen Energy and Environment. A question about regulation and carbon accounting. And do you think, or kind of measuring, do you think it should be, as it evolves, should regulation be more prescriptive or less prescriptive in general.
Great, thank you. So cultural changes, are you seeing any cultural changes?
So I think one of the things that we've really focused on within the NHS, a lot of our wider sustainability program has been driven by staff in the first place, which has been a really kind of interesting thing. You know, people work for the NHS, they tend to have a socially minded background and you know, think it's just important that we're taking care of the environment as well as health. But what I think the other thing that's really, you know, when you start to think about which suppliers you're going to choose to work with over other suppliers, or where you want to locate your offices and how you're going to make those organizational decisions, I think you need to give your suppliers a chance to get on board with your plan. And so what we've done with having our net zero supplier roadmap is that we're very clear about when we need our suppliers to be on board with this. And we've given them a lot of time. You know, we are in a climate emergency. We don't want to give them too much time, but we're trying to find a happy medium where they have enough time to prepare. But we don't necessarily say to suppliers, you're not any good, you're better, we'll use you. We say, we want to bring up the level of all of our supply chain and continue to be able to work with our suppliers. And those suppliers that fall behind and do so knowingly, we will stop working with. And I think so, that cultural change is something that needs to be led from a very charismatic and senior individual or a group of individuals within your organization, hopefully the board, who say this is important to us, this is why we're, you know, this is part of our company ethos. And you know, I think that if you can give people, if you can give your partners in this process proper time to prepare, I think you can really bring them along.
Great. And yes?
Can I add to the culture thing, because I really like that in that sense that when you have a net zero target, you actually need to think differently also. You cannot think just to be more efficient or let's do minus 10%, minus 20%. But if you have a net zero target, you actually need to do things differently. And I think that also triggers cultural change. That it's not about kind of optimizing your supplier. It's in some cases probably also changing your suppliers or changing your products. And I think these are key things that also are triggered in the cultural change.
And on the point on regulation, the role of regulation in Scope 3 emissions.
It's a great question. I haven't heard it asked quite that way. I think the simple answer is you want regulation in some cases to be more and in some cases to be less prescriptive. More in the sense of the ability to amortize a carbon impact over a number of years because of a new plant. There's new guidance coming out talking about land use change, amortized over 20 years. That makes sense. Surely you should have the same around capital investment and so on. So where principle is concerned, I think it needs to be more prescriptive and consistent and, you know, where necessary and where possible, tied into financial accounting, because that's pretty well tried and tested. Less prescriptive when regulation gets to the point where it actually ends up putting false accuracy onto choices you don't need to make today. Regulation that literally picks winners between technology options where the engineering hasn't yet been done. I mean, that's crazy. And yet there are quite a lot of standards out there and quite a lot of guidance where essentially there is an implicit choice being made about the best solution way before that can be substantiated by fact. So it's a really good question, and keep asking the question, because I think a lot of people need to change the way they think.
Sorry,
And maybe Elsa is here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I align a little bit with Tom here in that I've got two sides. One is, yes, I think, you know, it could be more prescriptive in terms of driving action, right? And I think there's need for more regulation to actually drive the change, and we don't have much time, right? So that is definitely something that will drive change, and even, you know, every company to actually you know, pay attention to this. Obviously, there's kind of the leverage throughout the supply chain, and there's accountability from the larger companies, but it will also trickle down to you know, everyone in the supply chain. I think it needs to be maybe also kind of less prescriptive in terms of avoiding, you know, everyone's fear of action in a way, because it's so complicated, right, to deal with Scope 3, and it just it's the largest part of emissions, but at the same time, it's so complicated. So I think in that sense, it needs to be less daunting. But there also needs to be more standardization so that the data can be comparable, and so the companies can actually, know what they need to account for, and it's not just a decision of, we're including this, we're not including that, because in the exchange of information, then it's really difficult to know you're speaking the same language with your supplier, right? When you get that data.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's kind of
Thank you.
my thoughts on that.
No, exactly. So I feel as we bring this session to an end, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you to the panelists. I feel comforted in some ways that Scope 3 is an imperfect art, and that many of us are getting it wrong, and actually there isn't 100% accuracy. You have to strive to get that holy grail of supplier-side data, but it's not 100% possible. And one of the things that I'm going to take away is that we need to be humble and sincere in the target setting and the commitments that we're making as we're on this journey. So thank you very much. A round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you. Great questions.